I want to talk about social networking because more and more legal issues coming up with the issue of social networking. And the article that I'm going to reference is written by a lawyer in Connecticut. And he is addressing the issue of employee privacy rights. So when you go out and get your first job, you're going to be given an employee handbook. And it's going to have policies in it, much like the Alvernia Student Handbook. In other words, the Alvernia Student Handbook is your legal document. It identifies your responsibilities, identifies your rights, it identifies what courses are supposed to be teaching, who the faculty are, every single resource you have on campus. Those are all legally your rights. Any violation of those can call for dismissal. So if you are not familiar with your student rights, you better learn to be familiar with your employee rights. Because many, many things are coming up with the use of the internet in the workplace. Whether it's, and some of you mentioned this already, an employee gets fired. Employee goes on Facebook, posts a bunch of things about the employer. Those are the lawsuits coming. Because under the legal system, that qualifies as defamation. And defamation means that you've either written or you've said something that damages the character of the individual. So, as college students, you're pretty casual with what you put up there. We've already talked about the fact that employers do look at your Facebook postings, photographs, etc. You need to clean it up. You need to clean it up now so that when you go into the workplace, you're not so casual, that you will not be hit with a defamation lawsuit. But if you are, you have to go back to the employee handbook. And if the employee handbook has a policy about the use of social networking sites, you're in trouble. You violated a policy. So, the only way for somebody to legally terminate you is if you've violated something in the employee handbook. Okay? So you have to be really, that has to be something that you read from the beginning to the end and backwards, and that you reference all the time. I know that that doesn't happen as much in college, and that's a problem for you. It's another example of how college doesn't relate to the real world. But that is like your Bible. If you have a problem with a professor, there is actually a grievance committee here where you could file a grievance. These are your rights. If you are told that you're going to be on probation, you can appeal that probation by looking at the handbook and taking the steps that it tells you to do. You have to write a letter, you have to get recommendations, and it goes to the Academic Standards Committee. So those are things that are your rights. Here's another one. I sit on Academic Standards. Let's say you started out in a major and you didn't do well, and you accumulated D's and C's. We have something here called the internal transfer. And that means that you can apply to have those courses dropped out of your GPA. You can only do 3, and you can only do it once. But it means that you are transferring from one major to another. So let's say I came in as a bio major. This happens a lot. And the student realizes, oh, I'm not really good at the sciences. But they've accumulated a bunch of bad grades. They can now apply for an internal transfer where you go to your advisor and you say to your advisor, I really am not cut out for this. I should really be this major. And those courses do not really apply to your major. So the internal transfer allows you to submit a request to drop those so they're taken out of your GPA, but they still stand on your transcript. So people will see the F, or they will see the D, or whatever it may be, but they're no longer averaged into the GPA. And speaking of GPA, those of you who did not put your GPA on your resume, now I told you, in the cover letter it's fine if you skip it, if it's less than a 3.0. But if you skipped it on the resume too, that's a red flag. That is a red flag. and your resume and cover letter will probably be ditched. Because that tells the employer that it's less than the 3.0, which means the best you could do in college was a C something. And that's not going to help. So there are policies and codes and things that are important for you to understand in this class, not only during college, but especially in a job that you could wind up with a lawsuit that is the beginning of the end of your career. Now, here's an example. The lawyer in the article talks about a restaurant, a small restaurant owner who fired an employee. She went on her Facebook and she made comments that he abused drugs. So he sued her. They settled, but and a lot of money went, of course, to litigation. But the lawyer said to him, if you had had a policy in your employee handbook, you could have won this, because settlement means no one wins, really. You could have won this, and you could have settled for a lot more. But because you didn't have it in, so you can't just fire people because you don't think they're good employees. You have to have the policies, and then you have to abide by the policies. So there are many, many things, and the other thing in this article that I wanted to talk about was that the other areas of lawsuits, which defamation means defaming, to defame somebody's character. Negligent misrepresentation. That means that on your resume, you have said that you were qualified and you had actually performed and done all these things, and somebody finds one little line item that you inflated. That is reason for termination. Falsifying your resume. Misrepresentation. The other one, invasion of privacy. Depending on the privacy code of ethics in the handbook, you have the right, and you have to make sure that you understand what employee privacy means. Employee privacy does not mean that you can shop on your laptop at work. Employee privacy means, for the most case, that your private business is no one else's business. But if you go to an employee and you share that privacy, that third person very possibly will share it with others. So I highly recommend that you don't. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and it's not really a litigation issue, is what's called the Seinfeld effect in the business world. It's what happens when you go to lunch at work and you talk about the movies you watch, or you talk about the cultural things that you participate in. And it's not gossip, it's really more small talk, but be careful about that. Because you might participate in some really bizarre computer games that might be shared with your boss. So there's a whole world of social networking, not just electronically, but verbally, where someone could go to the boss and say, are you aware of the fact that such and such is really into designing guns and bombs and who knows what? Yes.
Isn't that called water cooler chatter?
Yeah, well, the Seinfeld effect is the water cooler effect, because water cooler chatter is when you're on break. I mean, the idea came up with the Seinfeld show, where they would go to the water cooler and talk about people and their sex lives and all kinds of inappropriate things. And so it's used synonymously. So you want to be careful of what you think is safe and private. It really isn't. And people in the workplace can come up with things to fire you. And they may not be true. But if you're not familiar with your own rights, then you won't fight. So you have to be careful, and you have to document things. The last thing that I wanted to do as far as this topic is concerned, okay, here are some other issues that are involved in defamation suits. Employees making comments about a competitor, okay? Or what you do is you leave your job and you go to another job. Be careful. Be careful what you say about the place you left, because you just don't know where that information can go. So obviously not putting it on the internet, but also in your own dialogue. Take each job, learn as much as you can, and don't burn a bridge. So if you do happen to be terminated, you can write in a journal, you can say everything that you want, but take the high road and say, this is not necessarily about me, but it's an opportunity to grow in a different direction. So it's perception. When things end for you, and they will, don't view it as you need to necessarily fight it. You need to look at it as an opportunity to find a better job. And unfortunately, with the world the way it is, it's open season for entry-level hirees, because you're not as sophisticated. You don't really read the employee handbook. You're not really aware of privacy issues, etc. So I try to cover as many of those as possible. Here's another one, obviously, employees making comments about supervisors or co-employees. Employees making comments about the company's product. I would never, and I don't believe it anyhow, I would never say to someone that Alvernia is an easy college. Never. I would never say that it's an easy college to get into. I would never defame the product that I help to enhance. I mean, think about it. If you're bashing the company you work for, that is, you're part of the problem. You're there too. So if you're working for Kodak and you tell your friends, don't buy Kodak, it really, that's not a good thing, because it could come back to haunt you. So the biggest thing for us, and this is the ethical part of learning business communications, ask yourself when you want to say something that's not so good, if it's something that you would be willing to say to a group out loud. Then you're safe, it's okay. But if it's something that you wouldn't want a lot of people to hear, don't say it. So you catch yourself in that reality check mode, what is ethical and what is not.